Welcome, everybody. Glad you can be back with us, or welcome to the workshop for the first time this year if it's your first time. My name is Zach Lesser. I'm the faculty director of the workshop in the history of material texts, and I want to introduce my co-directors, Jerry Singerman, who's humanities editor at the Penn Press.
Welcome, everybody.
And John Pollack, curator for research services in the Kislak Center.
Hi, everyone.
And Philip Mogan is the Brisdell Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Texts, and we're very grateful to him, as always, for helping to make the seminar run so smoothly.
Hi, everyone.
So this is the 28th year of the workshop, founded by Peter Stallybrass in 1992. It's met every Monday during the semester at 5:15 since then. You can go to our website if you want to see the full schedule for the semester, pennmaterialtext.org. You can also sign up for our listserv there if you aren't already on it. And we've just launched a YouTube channel as well, thanks to Philip. So you can find last week's talk up on that channel now, and we'll be posting the new ones each week. Well, I'm really excited to welcome Autumn Womack to the workshop. Autumn's an assistant professor at Princeton with appointments in both English and African American studies. She earned her PhD from Columbia, and she's published essays in journals like Black Camera and International Film Journal, Paris Review of Books, LARB, American Literary History, and many other outlets. And her work bridges numerous areas of the history of material texts, from the 19th century to the 21st, from print to digital, from literature to information technology. She's finishing her first book, which will soon be published by the University of Chicago Press, entitled Undisciplining Data, Race, Visuality, and the Making of African American Literary Aesthetics, 1880 to 1930. This book deals with emergent visual technologies like photography, movies, and social surveys, tracing their relationship with Black literary and intellectual culture. She also has an essay forthcoming that I'm particularly excited to read on the prehistory of data visualization. Her talk tonight, though, is drawn from her second project, which sounds equally fascinating, the Reprint Revolution. It considers the politics and material practices of reprinting many 19th century African American literary texts in the mid-20th century. So please join me in welcoming Autumn Womack.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here, and it's so nice to see so many. I'm just scanning the pages, and it's so nice to see so many familiar faces, people that I wish I would have seen in person, and many people who have seen iterations and versions who have been really helpful in thinking through these topics. I saw Derek back there, and he was really formative in this project. So I'll get right to it. So today I'm going to tell a story that emerges at the nexus of Black studies, African American literary studies, and print culture. And it's really a story about the work that we ask the past to perform at particular historical junctures. And at this particular moment, one in which I found myself returning and turning towards books and printed material at an even more kind of ravenous pace than I have in the past, sometimes as a mode of escape and other times as a kind of nostalgic practice. I've also done more rereading over the past few months than I think ever before. I think it's especially important to meditate upon the conditions, material, cultural, ideological, and institutional, that produce the texts we reach for. More precisely, I'm interested in thinking about how and when the Black past in particular gets summoned to do political work at key historical moments. And our now is certainly one of those moments. So let me go ahead and share my PowerPoint. And I hate doing this because then I can't always see everybody, but here we are. Okay, cool. So our now is certainly one of those moments, or these moments this summer and in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. The public was not only marching, they were also reading. Indeed, wherever I turned, I found a blogger, a writer, an editor, or an academic issuing a reading list, sometimes voluntarily, other times through a formal request. On June 10th, for example, the New York Times printed the article, "People Are Marching About Racism, They're Also Reading About It," a survey of the record-breaking sales figures for books about anti-racism that included works like How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is probably still backorder, and White Fragility. reading about race and racism, the article suggested, was necessary to, if not equivalent with, anti-racist practice. 3 weeks later, the article, Every Work of Literature is About Race, Writers on How We Got Here, asked Black writers in particular to, quote, take a moment to look back at the literature that shaped their, and by extension our, racial attitudes. As the reporter put it, quote, in an effort to deepen our understanding of race and racism in America, we asked writers to share with us the texts that have done the most to deepen theirs. Together, these histories, novels, and verses have helped shape our collective consciousness of a subject that is irreducible and universal, end quote. So the titles range from Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, which was Henry Louis Gates's pick, to Nella Larson's Passing, which was Danzy Senna's choice, to Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which was offered by the historian Carrie Greenridge, to titles from the more recent past like Claudia Rankine's Citizen. Sourced by a highly curated crowd, the catalog of the titles the Times suggested would remind us of, quote, the ugly truths about our country that shouldn't have been forgotten in the first place. So I'm like just really consistently and constantly interested in the ways that Black literature is called upon, and the titles that are called upon. The summer of 2020 was not the first time that the New York Times would enter into the debate about political action through Black historical recovery. Today, I want to turn to a parallel moment, the late 1960s, and offer a social and material history of Arno Press, the New York Times' massive endeavor into the business of reprinting the Black past. In January 1968, the New York Times acquired a 51% stake in Arno Press, a small independent publisher run by Arnold's own. So I think everyone has probably seen these black and white books. I haven't returned it to the library in forever. Who knows what the fine is? I'm sorry, librarians. But you know, these black and white books, the Arno Press editions, everybody probably has or has seen. In April of that year, and with a double-page ad in Publishers Weekly, the new partnership announced the publication of their series, The American Negro, His History and Literature. The 45-volume endeavor, so they say it's going to be 44, but it ended up being 45, was touted as a landmark collection and the first large-scale attempt to resurrect the past. The American Negro signaled Arno Press's entrance into the popular business of reprinting African-American books, a business that, as Dorothy Porter, the director of Howard University's Moreland Spingarn Collection, expressed it, was largely characterized by white publishers' insatiable desire for, quote, putting into circulation everything Black they could get their hands on. Between 1968 and 1970, Arno Press published 3 series of African-American reprints, largely comprised of late 19th and early 20th century text. They released a collection of 30 paperbacks, and they forged relationships with notable Black institutions like the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture and the NAACP. Priced at $485 for the complete set, Arno Press's inaugural collection promised to be a necessary addition to libraries and schools. So by piecing together and piecing apart the politics behind the endeavor, I'll suggest that reprinting, as both technical process and political project, became an embattled site around which notions of Black political life were staged and ultimately delimited. So I'm really interested in kind of thinking about the work that reprinting does, and I'd be happy to hear more thoughts on this because I haven't fully fleshed this out beyond this project or this article. The New York Times Arno Press collaboration fashioned a catalog of African-American reprints that ultimately symbolized a geographically limited fiction of citizenship and a fantasy of interracial harmony. Framed as a recovery project that would illuminate the roots of the late 1960s racial politics so as to map a future where African Americans would recommit to the promise of citizenship, the American Negro series doubled as a rubric for social reform. So my own relationship to Arno Press and its Black History series probably mirrors that of so many other contemporary scholars, especially 19th century specialists. With their facsimile copied pages, the black and white cloth-bound volumes, which in many cases are still the only available editions of certain texts, are kinds of portals to the past. Together, the books create a voluminous ensemble of Black intellectual life, ultimately spanning over 100 titles. For critics of Black journalism in particular, volumes like Thomas Hamilton's The Anglo-African Magazine, which is the one I hijacked from the library, and Irving Garland Penn's The Afro-American Press and its editors are crucial touchstones. But if it's impossible to imagine Black literary studies without Arno Press, which I think it is impossible, especially the way that we think about and do Black studies and African American literary studies now, which is so archivally based and so invested in print culture. If we can't think of the field without these books, then the endeavor itself remains totally under-theorized. Where the series is addressed, most often in the ballooning body of work on the Anglo-African magazine, Arno Press is rather quickly praised for its capacious catalog and its role in making invaluable texts available, or as evidence of the efficacy of 1960s student activist movements who demanded a kind of more capacious catalog, which is how I imagined the story would roll out, and it's quite the opposite, in fact. If this thin, albeit prevailing account of Arno Press draws on and cements romantic fictions of the formation of Black studies and recovery work, then it has done so through focusing on individual titles rather than the series itself. Yet I'm interested in what it would mean to consider the collection as a republication program, which is how it was pitched. That is, as a cohesive endeavor that, in the words of its general editor, might, quote, fashion the intellectual tools necessary to solve our great racial problems. Moving in this direction requires that we read the Arno Press reprint project through the frame of reprinting and reproduction, but it also means taking seriously the imaginative limits and possibilities of these very modalities and mediums. Okay. So this is the original press release for this series. So on February 15th, 1968, and just to pause, so part of the reason why the Arno Press endeavor has been so under-theorized is because the New York Times archives had a massive fire, and many of the records surrounding this project were destroyed. So I had to kind of move through people's personal papers who were involved in the project to figure out what the story behind this was. So this is from the Schomburg. So on February 15th, 1968, publishers, librarians, and booksellers received an announcement about a forthcoming Negro history collection. The 6-page packet marketed the series as a direct response to the burning issue of Negro rights, which has, quote, begun to focus attention on the Negro's role in America's past. Faced with the reality that, quote, few books treating the Negro's role realistically have been available, the Arno Press series undertook a capacious archaeological effort that would, quote, make available the lost books about American Negroes, end quote. Traversing a range of genres and writers from the canonical, like Frederick Douglass, to the obscure, the release teased a series of books filled with surprises that can be of immeasurable value and bringing both self-understanding and mutual understanding to Americans, Black or white. Under the stewardship of William Loren Katz, a New York school teacher and the author of the textbook Eyewitness, The Negro in America, the series was promoted as equal parts recovery work and preservation. It would cement the relationship between past and present while rescuing Black literary archives from a so-called dark future. Within this discursive framing, the Schomburg was cast as an underfunded home to a rich archive of Black texts that were, as they said, uncatalogued and even crumbling into decay. So that's here. African American literary history was, of course, not lost. And while certainly under-resourced, over the course of the 20th century, Black historians and librarians built extensive collections of Black historical life in these very institutional spaces. If Black libraries were overflowing with texts, then it was less a matter of insufficient management, as the press release suggested, than it was owing to the sheer volume of materials that surfaced at mid-century. Jean Blackwell Hudson, the curator of the Schomburg collection, revised this gross mischaracterization when she insisted that of the 141 titles that Arno ultimately reproduced, only 2 came from the Schomburg, a figure that suggested that the purported textual rescue mission was far less dramatic than the press release would have it. Rather than being saved from the hands of irresponsible Black institutions, as they framed it, many of the books came from the private collection of African-American ephemera that the editor Katz and his father had amassed. But although this is happening subtly, and the announcement sets in motion an origin story premised on the metaphoric relationship between recovery work and social management that would ultimately determine the project's pivotal position in national debates about the place of Black life in the nation. Nevertheless, in spite of this highly problematic framing, just one day after the press release was circulated, Katz wrote to the newly appointed 7-person advisory board welcoming them to what was then simply called the Arno Press Negro History Project. So there's not a ton, but there's enough of this correspondence that goes back and forth, kind of planning out what the titles will be and such. As co-directors, Hudson and Katz were joined by advisory board members, including Porter, the aforementioned curator at Howard, Ernest Kaiser, a librarian at the Schomburg, Sarah Jackson, who was an archivist at the U.S. National Archives in D.C. Also on the board were scholars Doxy Wilkerson, who was a professor of education at Yeshiva, James McPherson, who's a professor of history at Princeton, he's still there, and Benjamin Quarles, a professor in the Department of History at Morgan State College. So it was also a mix between historically Black institutions and private, predominantly white institutions. Beyond relaying his enthusiasm, Katz's letter extended the press release's promise and reasoned that the ability to access the past would have profound political consequences. I know you are as excited about this project as I am and aware that it represents, since truth shall make us free, a giant step towards freedom. So that Katz understood Black historical recovery and political reform as mutually constitutive was certainly not without precedent. But by the late 1960s, interest in reconstructing Black American history surged. Following the civil rights movement's legislative gains, as well as its unmet promises, demonstrations in cities, and student demands for more inclusive curricula, the Black Past was summoned both to explicate the roots of the contemporary racial climate and to offer models for political future. In his aptly titled 1968 essay, The Uses of the Afro-American Past, the historian Vincent Harding charged that it would be impossible to look forward without a historic reckoning, which is the same language that we hear over and over again today. So Black periodicals like Negro Digest, for example, regularly had, a Negro history issue, but they were really amped up in 1968, 67, and 69. That was not chronological, but you guys get the drift. And so responding to this moment, a ton of Black presses had always had a publishing apparatus. So Ebony, for example, always had Johnson Publishing, but almost every major white publisher then created an arm just to reprint Black books. And it was called the reprint revolution. Yet in terms of breadth and depth, Arno Press was leading the charge. They really had their hands in every major archive and were able to reproduce and reprint most of the text. So from February 1968 to early spring of that year, Katz and the editorial board worked diligently to establish the contours of Series 1. In a preliminary letter to the board, he shared the broad outlines of the editorial vision. So my guidelines for selecting this initial group of books for the series has been to cover the entire Negro experience in America, with emphasis on historical, sociological, and bibliographic material, with particular emphasis on Negro authors. I've left specific works of poetry, literature, and drama for later coverage. This collection is aimed primarily at public university and high school libraries for the use of both laymen and scholars. So really this kind of publication program was the very thing that 5 years later, Toni Morrison would be working against or in opposition to when she assembled the Black Book, which is her editorial project. And in fact, she says this is not the white publishing efforts. Katz also included a working list of titles and invited board members to edit as they saw fit. The final roster reflects a range of factors from the availability of materials to members' personal preferences. Porter, for example, recommended the Atlanta University Studies and the American Negro Academy's occasional papers and minutes from the convention. And she noted, I've Xerox copied some early conventions of the people of color. There are about 40 or more which might not sell, but are invaluable for the scholar, as you know. So I want to linger here. I'm really interested in this distinction between what might not sell, what's invaluable, the distinction between, which is also the distinction between the popular and the serious. So this designation doubled as a code for Black and white readers and ultimately became the point of conflict between African-American publishing houses who were also reprinting and mainstream endeavors like Arno Press. In a prefatory note to their 1970 reprint of William Still's The Underground Railroad, which Arno Press also reprinted, Ebony Classics harnessed the scholarly versus popular divide as they sought to distinguish themselves from Arno Press. In a small contextualizing note printed in the front of the book, they explain, quote, "The series has been designed for clarity and eloquence in a public outside the research libraries. The text has been entirely reset in a combination of Bodini typefaces, which echo the original editions but are easier to read." Resetting type was not simply a matter of increased accessibility, of appealing to a Black readership beyond institutional walls. Rather, it also indexed the archival politics of care. Care here meant reproducing text with an eye towards the particularity of the titles and their capacity to register meaningfully for individual readers. But it also meant attending to the textual object itself as more than just evidence of Black historical life or proof of the success of a reprinting endeavor. Thus, even as the facsimile reprint strategy was successful at quickly reproducing large numbers of text, so Arno's were just, for those of you who haven't seen, I mean, they were literally just like Xerox copies of the original. You can't quite see that, but you get the drift. So while it was successful at quickly reproducing these large number of texts, and it's why Arno could do so many, detractors saw the technology as at best manifesting appropriation and exploitation, and at worst, the refusal of the press to recognize a broad audience of Black readers beyond librarians and researchers. As late as 1971, critics still argued that in capitalizing on the reproductive value of Black literature, white reprinting endeavors were enacting a form of violence akin to rape, and these were their words. Publishers Weekly printed a heated exchange between Katz, Hudson, and Bradford Chambers, who was the head of the Council of Interracial Books for Children, in which Chambers concluded by praising Johnson Publishing as the only entity to, quote, "show enough interest and to care enough to reset type for a major series of Black studies." And framing Johnson's decision to reset rather than reprint as a recuperative act that could begin to redress the violation wrought on the archive, Chambers draws out the ethical stakes of Black recovery work and reminds us that above all else, Black archives document actual life. Yet Arno was never interested in easy consumption of its books or mainstream popularity. And by the end of February 1968, the editorial board finalized the scope of Series 1. So I don't know if you guys can see, this is actually for the second edition, second group of volumes. But we begin to see how they kind of started to think about organizing the volume. So there was group 1, group 2, group 3. He would send out the list. People would cross out, add on. These are from Dorothy Porter's papers. So the little check marks are things that she had at Howard that she could send. Question marks are things she needed to get. She would cross out things that she didn't think were valuable. And this is how this series came about. And the titles in Series 1 are quite diverse. So they were arranged under headings like slavery, years of crisis, the Civil War, Western frontier days, the New Deal, and then they would go on to produce more literary texts. And they contained well-known titles like Frederick Douglass's 1855 autobiography, but also lesser known titles like The Garys and Their Friends, which was out of print until this series. And texts that we don't even approach anymore, like John Cummings' Statistical Analysis, Negro Population in the United States. So it's also interesting. I'm really interested in thinking about the tension between how they imagined a archive that would constitute a canon of Black studies and actually what ended up then being taken from it. So the titles in the American Negro, His History and His Literature would seem to assert an African-American historical tradition defined by a commitment to continually revising the terms of race and nation, right? This is a diverse group of texts. But what happened is that through press advertisements and the rhetoric that emerged around it, the project became domesticated and it ultimately reaffirmed a sense of shared heritage and a deep commitment to US nationalism. Nowhere is this clearer than in the May 26 New York Times advertisement introducing the publishing endeavor to a broad readership. Printed in bold font that takes up nearly a quarter of the page, the announcement promised a transformative textual encounter that would culminate in the recovery and discovery of a consolidated interracial national identity. As the advertisement boasts, quote, now all of us, Black and white, can learn the true history of the Negro in the US in 45 books America forgot. Marketed to schools, libraries, and concerned individuals, the series was proffered as a necessary appendage to the community, quote, this is their words, community relations programs of business organizations, labor unions, and religious and fraternal groups. And so we can see we see the two branches, the two series, and they list all the titles. You can both order them, but this is quite a bit of text to wade through. As it turned out, by providing indisputable proof of African Americans' participation in nation building, the series offered a balm for racial antagonism, an antidote for the violent racism that just several weeks earlier, following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., transformed the landscape of the nation's major cities. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to read through the text. You guys can peruse it. But what's important here is that this project gets refracted through the frame of liberal optimism here. And here, literary production uncovers a previously unknown historical period, one in which African Americans were present for and indeed contributed to every major stage of nation building, from the earliest moments of the Revolutionary War to the battle at San Juan Hill, from expeditions to the North Pole to innovations in the mass production of shoes. Suppressed by, quote, the unconscious racism that perpetually evacuated Blacks from the historical record, African Americans' contributions, the advertisement suggests, lurk just below the surface of the dominant national narrative, while historical recovery and literary reproduction lubricate the pathway towards racial integration. The announcement renders the virtue of the reprint program not so much in terms of either the formation of a distinct field of study or canon. Instead, reprinting is charged with consolidating US national identity, or to borrow the language of the advertisement, the project of, quote, integrating the study of the Negro into American history, of creating the grounds from which, quote, all of us can engage in a project of collaboration, cultural appreciation, and ultimately national expansion. So it's also interesting here that the advertisement celebrates Blacks' participation in all of these acts of conquest and expansion, like the American Revolution, the Spanish-American War, and westward expansion. On the shelves of school libraries, labor unions, and community centers, Black and white books would peacefully sit alongside one another, modeling the kind of interracial harmony that by 1968 was a frustrated fantasy. Together, the 1967 uprisings and the findings from the Kerner report led to the popular, if incorrect, historical narrative in which the progressive phases of the civil rights movement were left in shambles, paving the way for the emergence of radical modes of Black separatism and the abandonment of the myth of interracial solidarity. But as the Arno Press series imagines it, the history of racial struggle is enduring and has always been concerned with articulating a shared national identity and achieving the full range of citizenship rights. So they're really interested in domesticating this radical political vision or suppressing it altogether. In this regard, the announcement offered the reprint as a technology that could order historical knowledge and correct the course of an increasingly fractured narrative of racial struggle by reminding Blacks and whites that interracial collaboration was fundamentally American. So just as the story gets weirder, so just when series one was beginning to shift, Arno Press found itself at the center of a proposal for the Commission on Negro History and Culture, first introduced by Senator Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania. Bill 12962 aimed to create a commission to study all aspects of the problems of preserving, collecting, and integrating evidence of the Negro past into the mainstream of American education. As Senator Scott put it in the opening remarks of this hearing, our negligence of the Negro role in American history is both the cause and effect of prejudice today. The Negro and his fellow Americans must share full knowledge of their common past and their common goals, end quote. Evoking the terms of a usable past in ways that mirror the logic of the Black printing efforts, Scott argued that accessible historical knowledge would assuage the moral tension that currently characterize the racial climate. So this report is actually quite fascinating. I mean, it's not that long. It's not a quick read, but it's readable. It's like 140 pages, and it includes everything from like transcripts from a special on Black history that Bill Cosby did to testimony from Black Panthers. Like it really is itself quite an interesting archive. But Arno Press featured heavily in this. And the Negro History series was called upon again and again and again as evidence of the kind of work that literature could do, even though it hadn't even shipped yet, and the project hadn't even gotten off of the ground. So what does it mean that the American Negro, his history and his literature, was called upon as evidence of the integration of Black history into American history? To be sure, the proposal for the Congressional Commission on Negro History and Culture's celebration of Arno Press concerns what I've been suggesting is the utility of the past to nation building. At the same time, and from a related perspective, summoning the past as evidence also reduces Black historical life to mere information, right? So it enfolds it within this progressive genealogy and progressive historical temporality, when in fact the texts were doing something much more interesting when we think about how the texts were operating as a unit. And so the idea that the text could be folded into this progressive historical narrative ended up being, on the one hand, quite problematic for students who were heading up these Black studies programs, and on the other hand, quite encouraging for kind of a neoliberal project. So this tension was put in no uncertain terms during the testimony of Ronald W. Bailey, who was then a treasurer at Michigan State's University Black Student Alliance and is now a professor at University of Illinois. For Bailey, circulating the Black past as mere evidence, right, of an interracial project risks reducing the scope of African American historical achievement into a litany of facts that, while impressive, could easily be filed and forgotten, challenging the notion that simply producing material would trigger some sort of political transformation. He warned, "My point is that the mere recitation of the names of Black Americans who have discovered various states, invented the traffic light, or contributed to the cultural development of this country is not the ultimate concern. The facts cannot be fully appreciated unless they are viewed in the entire framework of American history, and their great impact on this history is carefully assessed." While the hearing called for the collection of more research, Bailey rejected the idea that evidence alone could activate policy shifts. Underscored by its refusal to distinguish research from activism, Bailey's testimony makes a national call for a mode of Black study that is committed to what he calls the efforts to restructure the fabric of urban society. Perhaps recognizing the demand for Black study that surfaced in the congressional hearings in February 1969, and this is the thing I'll end with, the famed historian C. Van Woodward authored a glowing review of the American Negro, his history and his literature, which should tell us everything about how the project landed within an assimilationist project that further enshrined the series' place within a discourse of U.S. nationalism. While he acknowledged the broader contributions of other Black reprinting projects, Woodward celebrated Arno for its integrity, noting, quote, "The titles chosen put this particular enterprise beyond suspicion of vulgar commercialism," end quote. Woodward's focus on the advisory board selection process slyly undercuts the work of contemporary writers and publishers, who he suggests might be simply capitalizing on the public's appetite for Black history, while also exploiting this binary between the serious study and the popular that I was drawing out before. At the same time, Woodward's phrasing takes aim at independent Black presses and bookstores like Dudley Randall's Detroit-based Broadside Press, and bookstores that also doubled as printing presses. So this is something else that I'm really interested in. So for Woodward, the legitimacy of Arno Press was precisely what he took to be its refusal to pander to readers' desires and its commitment to what he described as scholarship over politics. He put this matter in, sorry, my dog is scratching away at the couch. If you hear something strange, it's him. So he puts this matter in no uncertain terms when he writes, "The American Negro, his history and his literature is a serious effort to meet a legitimate need. It is not popular history. It belongs in the scholar's library rather than the activists. Those who raise the loudest demand for Black studies will rarely bury themselves in these volumes, and they are not likely to burden the shelves of the average Muslim temple or organizer's pad." The nod to the organizer's pad and the mosque's bookshelves undoubtedly evokes Malcolm X's best-selling autobiography, as well as works by Frantz Fanon and Amy Césaire, all of which were imagining Black liberation in a global sense and were also being reprinted and printed and circulated at a rapid rate at this time. For Black-themed bookstores like Washington, D.C.'s Drum and Spear, Mary Baraka and Martin Luther King Jr. were highly sought-after authors, as was Du Bois. So, yeah, it's Woodward's casual derision of Black studies that's most instructive here. For by the winter of '69, nationwide student protests and movements had led to the successful creation of Black studies programs. Libraries, like independent bookstores, were regularly sites of activism and protest, and the inclusion of more diverse library catalogs was often included in protesters' lists of demands. Woodward's refusal to recognize Black and African American studies as legitimate disciplines is also a failure to appreciate that for African American intellectuals, scholarship was always a mode of activism. His disregard for or ignorance of this key point contributes to affirming the efficacy of the popular framing of Arno Press as an intellectually rigorous enterprise, as well as a repository of a Black past that would direct readers, Black and white, toward a kind of colorblind universalism, and as a site that would suppress other international and transnational modes of insurrection and ultimately collaboration. So I'll end here, and I'll say that ultimately, the Black past that was evoked by the editors of the American Negro, its history and its literature in the name of political freedom, and which was reimagined as a narrative of progressive liberalism, they both failed to deliver on their grand promises, right? But at this moment, one in which we are continually being asked to summon the Black past again and again and again to keep doing political work and reimagining in often not that creative ways. I think that we can look back at this moment and really imagine and ask ourselves what use we're asking Black history and the Black past to perform. All right, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Autumn. That was great. So we're going to open the floor or screen, I guess. We're going to open the screen to questions. And remember, you can, if you open your participants panel, you should have the little raise hand button, the little blue hand. And if you use that, that's the easiest way for us to keep track of who'd like to ask a question. And you can also use the chat if you prefer. So, open for questions.
Should I take them?
I can, if you can if you want, but if you'd rather not,
I'll follow you.
then you don't have to worry. It's one less thing to worry about. So JC, go ahead.
Hi. Hi, Adam. So good to see you.
I know, it's so nice to see you.
Thank you so much. This is so great to learn about this project and all of the strands that you're able to bring together here. There was a couple of little things that you said that kind of created this little synchronicity in my brain, and I just want to ask about it, about personal papers, really, and kind of the relation that this project has in a way to personal papers, both in terms of how your methodology ended up kind of having to go in that direction, but also in how you were talking about how the role of the editor and the editor himself, right, as a personal collector, ended up needing to go to the artifacts that he himself and others had collected in order to fill in those gaps that will create the as wide a project as they wanted it to be. And then you also mentioned how you yourself, because of this fire, the New York Times had to then dig deeper into people who were personally involved in the project and might have remnants of elements that are related to this endeavor and this republication project as kind of central to it. So all of that kind of leading to, well, any of those elements, if you want to speak to that, but also the role of the personal in not just the utility of the past for nation building, but the utility of like personal papers in nation building. So making that leap from the one individual and their own actions, right, of what they preserve and curate, all the way to that larger sphere of nation building. And how, because I was also reminded of, things we ask about Alan Locke and his role as editor for the New Negro Anthology in that 1925 moment versus this moment, and all of that.
Yeah. Okay. let me sift through. So maybe to kind of work from the easiest question, which is like, what it means to find, I think, like what it means to find evidence of this, or maybe what it means on the part of the editor, which was Katz, which really did, I mean, he really did have good intentions, but he really was kind of the quintessential like late 1960s liberal who was like this recovering the past will save the future. So I think like there's a couple of things that we see, there's tensions that we see in his editorial vision, and then when we look to the personal papers, and maybe I'm answering your question, maybe not quite, but I think one of the interesting things that happens when we look at the personal in relationship to this project of nation building, right, which we do think of as being two such different things, even though they're of course not always, is that we do see kind of the tensions and the fissures, but also the competing visions for what this project might have looked like, right? And I think a conscious awareness, perhaps, that the project of curating and saving stuff would eventually lead to the telling of this story that was a story that, as Katz always put it from the very beginning in his correspondence, was a story of nation building. Now, there's also, I mean, I think where the really interesting stuff happens is probably what we don't have records of. So there's often like in every kind of archive in this period, like phone call me at this time. And I feel like that's where the really interesting part. So there is also, and I think one of the limits or one of the roadblocks that I ran up against is that the personal papers are also so around this Arno Press project, because it was such an institutional project, right, are so formalized and highly curated, right? So because this was a project that was coming from a place like the New York Times, everything was formalized in a different way, where some of the other aspects of these people's papers weren't. The story also just keeps kind of unfolding because of how you well know that more papers are getting released. Like for years, when I first started thinking about this, which I think was in grad school, it was just like a pet project, I could find nothing. And then slowly, I'm like, oh, I would check like once a month. I'm like, oh, the Schomburg has something listed on their catalog now. Okay. So the story may very well shift again. So I think that begins to kind of sketch through your ideas.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Great, Laura. Go ahead, Laura.
Hi, thanks for this wonderful presentation. Can everyone hear me? Okay. So, you know, I don't know a lot about your era of expertise, but I'm an early modernist. So in some ways I've had a lot of experience, especially with looking at women and women of color, you know, in particular, of like looking at somebody from the 17th or 18th century and then trying to find out something about their work or life and finding out that it's a little known figure. And so I can only find sources in the 19th century and they have their whole weird interpretation that's very different from what I might, you know, have to say about this figure. So I can relate from my own research to what you're saying about there being this kind of patina of editorial attitudes, you know, on top of these texts that are being resurrected. And I know you're problematizing that in some ways, you know, how much, you know, how they're being resurrected and so on. But I was wondering, because you talk about some of these texts are still only available in this much older format, and they haven't been re-edited. And they're, you know, so I was wondering, sort of a two-part question. One, like, how do you think of dealing, like, if you're, it's one thing if you're the researcher and you're kind of thinking through all this, but I was wondering, pedagogically speaking, when you're, if like this is the only text available to your students, like how you guide them to understand the apparatus and the sort of the lens through which these texts are being presented. And then I think this other question would be like, if they were going to make new editions of some of these texts, what are the lessons we should be learning, like in modern publishing, to do this better or to advance? Like, what would be the sort of key things you would think, you know, you would hope that we would have learned from lessons of the past? Yeah,
no, that's a really good question. Thank you. So the first part, when I teach this material, like my primary field of study is the 19th century. So I am not somebody, so I am also like, who knows if what I'm saying is actually like that revolutionary in terms of the 1960s, but I'm a 19th century person, which is, so I came to this moment by way of my interest in these 19th century texts. So when I teach my 19th century class, which I'm teaching now, or I teach kind of a class about print culture, I mean, what I always emphasize, and I think what is important is I channel them to these texts and frame it as in terms of a created tradition. Like these texts are, the Black literary tradition is only a tradition as we imagine it, right? And it gets imagined and it's ensnared in all of these kind of late 1960 liberal policies and kind of this crisis over really what they imagined was a rearticulation of the 19th century Negro problem, right? Like this is restaged in the 1960s, but in very similar terms. So it's also interesting to me that these 19th century texts that were also being charged with solving the 19th century Negro problem are being reharnessed in the 1960s, right, to do that same kind of work. So I give them all of that framing, and we really talk about the moments when the Black past is asked to do particular kinds of political work. And it is at these nodal points, right? Like it's at the 1890s, it's in the 1920s, right? It's in the 19s, it's at these moments of national crisis. It's right now when everybody is like, pick up, what are you reading? It better have a Black author on that list, right? So I frame it for them in that way. I don't have an answer about how to do better now. I do think kind of, an editorial apparatus that would frame it in terms of the question or the problem of how we imagine the past doing work for us now, I think is crucial. Yeah.
Can I have a question that kind of follows up on that about the politics of the project here. It's one of the things I found completely fascinating about what you were showing us was the way that the technology of textual reproduction became very conscious to people and politicized so that, and I just wonder if you could do a little more to unpack that for me, because it seemed like you had on the one hand the technology of typesetting, in the case of the Ebony project, and some kind of, maybe I assume it must be like photolithography or something that's reproducing the facsimile text for the Arno. And then that gets associated with questions of audience and reception, like popular or scholarly. And then that gets associated also with more or like radical politics or sort of, a kind of mealy-mouthed liberalism. And it's amazing to see that the technological aspect is so front and center with people who are not themselves, book historians or readers or anything, right? So can you say more about the association there? Like, what is it about the question of whether it's a facsimile? I can see why the facsimile text might be thought of as more scholarly because it is, at least in today's academy, I could see that because it's like reproducing the historical text more. But was that operative already in the late 60s? And what about is the resetting type simply because it's easier to read, therefore it's more accessible to people? I mean, I just thought that was pretty kind of unusual, that kind of self-conscious discussion of the technology underlying.
Yeah. No, I was excited to find it and to find that kind of debate that was in Publishers Weekly. So a couple of things just popped into my mind. So yes, like it was, and I'm really interested in this too. I mean, it was the idea that it was more accessible when it was reset, right? Because the facsimile, it's quite difficult to read, or it's not that difficult, but it is not, it's presenting itself as an archival document, right? In a different way than resetting, which then, gives at least the illusion, right, of this as being for a popular audience. But the other thing that I think is really interesting is that so many of these boundaries between book printing and readers, like they were muddled back then, right? So I'm also really interested in Black bookstores that were also doubling as printing presses, right? So there was, these sites of reading were also sites where people were thinking through and encountering these terms in a different way. It's not like now where you go into a bookstore and it wasn't, the printing press was so far removed. In many cases, they were reprinting right there. So I think that they're naming that, and also kind of the ease with which the facsimile copies could be made, right, is the thing that was like, this is just becoming a project of appropriation. I mean, that was the argument, that it's about quantity, right? You just want more and more and more and more and more. You're asking. I mean, we see that in some of the papers. Dorothy Porter's like, you didn't send this back to me. Like, you were supposed to send it back. You have a lot of our material. Where is it? So just kind of the co-opting this material did become kind of a battleground. And really, I mean, it also was a battleground over Black history, where like who can tell, who has it, who can own it, which I think gets staged here. But yeah, it is that it came down to the typeset versus that Ebony was like, we have reset and Bodini type, and now everybody can read it. Is
yeah, it's interesting too, because I mean, this is not my period, but I've done a little work on like facsimile stuff.
Oh, good, yeah.
In other contexts, you know, you see a different discourse around these facsimiles, which is like we're releasing them to the public. You know, the facsimile, the cheap reproducibility of facsimile makes available these texts that otherwise only the scholar, you know, who can get into the archives could see. So that it has a popularizing aspect, which is interesting to me precisely if in this case there's an exception to that trend because of the politics of appropriation that you're talking about. Anyway, let me call on Anthony Grafton.
Thank you for that really rich paper. It was the detective story aspect of it was really enthralling, and I enjoyed it. And your deconstruction of the really rather revolting advertising, even I think in the terms of its own time, and certainly in retrospect, was very compelling. I'd like to suggest just a couple of other contexts, partly coming off what Zach said. So it seems to me, looking back, that there are a number of contexts that might even add to the story. One of them is this interest in typography, which was actually fairly widespread among publishers in the 50s and 60s, often as a mark of quality. Knopf, for example, famously always had a note in every book explaining why they had chosen a particular typeface for a particular text and who had invented the typeface and cut it first. Dover, which was one of the pioneers of offset reprinting, always had a note explaining the high quality of its book production. They obviously weren't changing the typefaces because they did straight reproduction, but every Dover book had a note pointing out that this was printed on acid-free paper and the binding was sewn rather than glued. So there was some expectation in the 50s and 60s that customers were actually interested in these things. And that's a wider field of expectation. That beautiful note about the Bodoni type is one campaign within a wider kind of field of debate. As for reprinting, that's also, I mean, the question of what's a good text is a huge subject of debate at this point. A year, I think, after this series comes out, Edmund Wilson will publish The Fruits of the MLA, his pamphlet denouncing the MLA's efforts to produce critical editions of American authors, which he thought were too big, too bulky, and too full of useless information to be of value to anybody. And he would make the proposal that has ultimately led over a long period to the Library of America. So there's a kind of debate about what it is that you should be doing if you're bringing texts back. And straight reprinting is one plan, though Peter Stallybrass knows more than I do about the problems that could attend that, the famous Yale facsimile of the first folio, in which two Yale scholars produced a facsimile, but the typographer, the people who were responsible for the text, found bleed through and they cleaned it up. And in doing that, they actually made errors in the text, which became known, what was it, the foul folio? When I was a grad student, it actually had a particular name. So, doing facsimile reprinting could be very reliable if it was done properly, but just like Google Books, it could also be screwed up in lots of ways. So there was debate. Should you do critical editions? Well, ideally, but how are you ever going to manage to do critical editions of all the text that we need, particularly in new fields? And this was a preeminently important new field, but by no means the only one that scholarship was opening up. If you reset, that of course is also a problem, which calls for a lot of proofreading, which wouldn't always be possible to do given the means supporting it. So there's a lot of discussion here, and it would be, I think, helpful to put it in that larger context. These people are not just talking to one another, they're talking in a kind of larger discursive field about what's the right thing to do. Yeah. The final point, which I think is really critical here, is greed. This is the end of that period when libraries were expanding, new research universities were basically opening, had to fill their libraries with materials, and those materials were not available as secondhand and rare books. So one of so among the firms that sprang up to supply them were Gregg reprints, Scholar reprints, both of which were in my early modern field preeminently. Arno, which did many, many series. I mean, they also did major science fiction series, for example, with the same kind of canonizing and problematic, problematic in a very different way ideas. So what I'm wondering is, is there a way in which to get a little bit more of that wider sense? Because my own belief is I have absolutely no objection to your beautiful reconstruction of the ideology behind the selection, the advertising, and the way in which C. Van Woodward bought into that in his reply. But surely one reason that they present things in this way is that they want to get a big hunk of the market, which at that point looks like a healthy market, and nobody realizes that it's going to go completely into downward spirals within a couple of years, sending many of these companies which had sprung up into bankruptcy.
Yeah, no, I think, thank you for that. And that's a really useful larger context to think about it within. Just as a flag, I didn't talk about this for time, but there was a whole conversation amongst him and the editors about whether we should do critical editions or just straight reprints. And he decided on just straight reprint. Like, he actually wanted these, and there's a lot of, he explains this at some length, Katz does, about how he was not interested in editorializing. He didn't want, he wanted just a complete reprint. He was like, these over and over, these will not be editions, these will be reprints. There were folks who were doing other reprints. To your point about greed, absolutely, right, that these were quite expensive for libraries. Libraries were swelling, yes, thank you for reminding me of that, but they also had, very particular budgets for Black books at this time. So I do think that there's that this moment, right, met with this demand, which I think is the most interesting part, that this really rich publishing moment and reprint moment met with the demand for this Black historical knowledge. And that's where the tension between the reprinting and the resetting comes in too, because the Black publishers like Johnson Publishing House, who had been publishing these Black texts throughout the 1960s and 1950s, right? They're like, this is not, we've been doing this for quite some time. So that you're entering into this market now purely for, one way to read it is just for financial gain. I think you're right that this was a grab. That's when importers, like, they just want everything they can get their hands on. So that, and that's why there is this publication of these kind of obscure random texts. And I'm like, why this statistical study, right? I'm interested in statistics. I write on them and nobody else is. It's always on the library shelf. So there is this way that, I think you're absolutely right, that it's part of this moment, and really this commercialization of the Black past too. Yeah.
Hard to imagine a moment when university libraries looked like a massive profit center for publishers to exploit. I guess more like journal publishers now than anything else.
Yeah.
But thank you. This is a wonderful enterprise. If we ever actually get back to like seeing one another on campus, I'd love to talk more about it.
That would be lovely. Thank you. I appreciate that so much.
Shira, go ahead.
Okay, hi everyone. Hi Autumn. This is a wonderful project. I have two questions. One is just a question of clarification, which puts us back to Zach's question. And I just wanted to be sure I was understanding. I thought that you were affiliating the resetting with something like CARE. And I was just wondering if you could enunciate that a little bit more, because it's a very exciting idea. So that's the first question. And the second is about, I was really struck in your project and in this Q&A with the way I started to think about value as something that sort of, if we center value, then you have then it gets pulled in two directions or multiple directions. One is something that is valuable because it is so wanted that it gets like bootlegged. If you think about like, I think about like my husband's always watching films that like somebody has taken on their iPhone in a movie theater because they've seen it first, like that. And this somehow, adds value to these, so that the idea that the film is great because like, it's so great that you're willing to risk a really poor delivery of it.
Yeah.
So there's this sort of bootleg adds value idea, but the other side, right, is that that high production and high reproduction adds value. That's something that a sign of how something is valued is that it's given money, right? And I would say our academic careers are supported by this idea that to do research that is good, you have to do research that's expensive, right? That our CVs have to somehow like, manifest our ability to procure funding for our projects, and therefore the idea that you could sort of make something meaningful out with very few resources is not actually rewarded in our system as much as the pricey version of doing research. But I guess my question is, I wonder, what do the Black books themselves have to say about this? That is to say, is there a way we could kind of reach into some of these texts and recover some idea about like how literature is transformed and reproduced, and what would it be like to maybe give voice to those traditions from within the texts themselves?
Yeah, no, thank you. It's funny, just really quickly, I'll start in the middle. It's so funny because I think about like bootlegging as actually a sign of like devalue. Like I'm not going to pay money to see this movie. I'm just going to buy the $3 bootleg. So, I mean, it's interesting to think about it in the reverse, but I don't know. I used to always buy like bootleg CDs. So maybe that's where I'm coming from. I don't even think they make CDs anymore. But okay, so the question of CARE. Yeah, I mean, that idea came from the really heated debate that was republished in Publishers Weekly, where he said your republication program is not showing any care. Like, you just don't care about this, right? And there is something, right? Just even given the time it takes to reset the type, right? Rather than just the facsimile copy, that I do want to suggest is registering, if only implicitly, like a different care, right? For if not only the text itself, then who is going to be actually reading it? I mean, the other thing that happened with all of the facsimile, and this is in a lot of the correspondence, is that the books got really damaged. Really, really incredibly damaged. So they would say like, you sent this back and it's like falling apart, right? And these were already pretty fragile documents. So there is something about the valuing of the text as an archival record that I think does get staged in the resetting of the type, or at least that was the argument that the man was making in Publishers Weekly. What was the last thing? Because I wanted to say something about that.
Oh, I was just asking whether we can find kind of traces.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Yeah, within the literature,
Yeah. Okay,
within the books that are being produced.
Yeah, I didn't talk about this, but I do go in and read kind of the theories of collecting, archiving, and assembly that are staged in the text. So I look at William Still's The Underground Railroad, which is in itself a model in collecting and archiving, kind of reading across documents and across times the theory of assembly. I think Marlon Delaney's Condition and Elevation also is really, that's one of the first texts that they reprinted in series 1. And there he's actually articulating a national imaginary that's quite different from this consolidated liberalism, right? I mean, he's arguing for a hemispheric transnational vision that ultimately ends in migration to Central America, right? So the thing that gets erased, right, in the pitching of this project is actually how these texts are sounding their own theories about nationhood, reprinting, citizenship, right? It's there in the text. The Garys and Their Friends is a text. I'm teaching it this week, so it's fresh in my mind. That's all about art, literature, and capital, right? And it's rethinking the relationship of those terms through a Black middle-class family, right? It's all about these encounters with aesthetic objects, literary and otherwise. So there also is kind of a decided refusal to engage with the text themselves here, right? In the pitching of it, right? In the advertising, right? For these curators and librarians, they were deeply invested in that project, but that's what gets erased and subsumed. So yeah, thank you for
That's such an interesting answer. Thank you so much.
Are there other people with questions out there who want to jump in? Peter. You're muted, Peter.
Thank you very much, Jordan. That was great, really fascinating. I've got a couple of questions. The first is about to what extent the division that's so kind of offensive to us between activists and scholars, the way that's put by Woodward, you know, the notion that to be a scholar is necessarily not to be an activist. To what extent is that one that's actually discussed and negotiated and talked about? I'm thinking particularly by writers in the present and how you think about it. So that's the first question. And I'm thinking about, like, in a global scale, in some ways that's rather an odd way to look at things, because although I think it's very common, you know, in some countries, but like in Cuba, after the revolution, the first minister of culture, Retamar, the first speech he gave was about Caliban. So it was literally a history of performances of The Tempest and how it had been performed and how it had been interpreted. So in other words, the past for him, for Retamar, was immediately politically important. It was part of his activism. It wasn't like something you sort of thought of separate. So that's the first question. Is that something that sort of people are thinking about and working on? The second is thinking about Black writers and editors and what their strategies are. And I'm thinking as an analogy of what all the different strategies that came up from feminist presses about how they wanted to market in bookshops, and often very tense arguments. So I'm forgetting what the press was, they actually produced their own book stands in bookshops. So all their books were marketed together. It was green, and they did a fair amount of reprinting too from the past. But many authors objected to that and felt that, so you got tensions there, and the same kind of tensions I think that you get amongst women writers, gay writers, Black writers on both sides. Do you want to be actually marketed this way, or do you want to be, so what are the different strategies and how do those play out as tensions within amongst Black writers, editors, and so on?
Yeah. I mean, the question about the activism scholarship divide, I think it's quite interesting. It is, like, as you're narrating it, right, it is also quite odd, right? But I think, like, what for me is so interesting about it in this time period is that he really was drawing a line between Black studies programs and what he saw as not Black studies programs, right? And also kind of associating Black studies programs with having this internationalist conception of Blackness, right? So that was what was so alarming, and what was so heartening about the Arno Press series is that it was all about domesticating radicalism through a kind of erasing all of these narratives and fissures that Shira was bringing up or suggesting were there. I mean, it's interesting also to think about Black editors and Black writers. I mean, what becomes, I think why this becomes such the Arno Press series becomes such a ground for debate, but also harnessing by this date, is that most of these authors, almost all of them were dead, right? So there was a problem with Marcus Garvey's papers because his family was like, no, they were like, you cannot republish them. And they listed like a really high price to pay for it, and they ultimately said, no, it's not worth it. So there is something about dealing with the idea of the archive, the idea these are archived texts, right? That I think it's so different. I mean, another project that I'm working on looks at a bookstore that was reprinting kind of live writers' texts, right? So, and that was much different, right? And they did have very particular ways that they wanted their texts presented, wanted them reprinted, wanted them circulated, wanting them presented at the bookstores. But I mean, all of these writers that were working with a usable past, right, allowed all of these, they didn't have a say. Like they all actually looked identical, and there was no debate about it, at least from the part of the writers. And because these weren't editions, right, there was no room for Black editorial intervention either. So it did just become kind of like this erasure of any room for debate. Yeah, which is again odd for this time period.
Yeah. Thank you.
I was muted. John, go ahead.
Thank you so much. This is a great discussion. I just thought I'd just throw a few more things out there. Of course, as a librarian, the library politics are interesting, and you talked about that with Tony a minute ago, but there was that great statement that you read, the sort of conjuring the vision of decay and destruction in the library. And I love that your irony that you slipped in fact, that books are destroyed by reproducing them, not by sitting in the dusty old library. But it's an interesting sort of conceit in the kind of long history of libraries, I guess, this sort of notion of crumbling into dust and salvation of texts, and that rhetoric is just interesting. And then I'll just throw a few other questions out. What was the most contemporary text that they chose to print, and how far back did they go? Can you get a sense at all with this, what survives of back and forth between this editorial committee and Katz? Did he have did he make all the calls himself? Was it really his project? Is there sort of like, are there good examples of something that is left in or left out that you can get a sense of discussion around? I mean, I take your point that you just made about there's no editorial voice because these are not edited, so you can't.
Yeah.
So
Right.
where can we find debate about a canon even as they're making it? I guess it would be interesting to see. And then I guess just a final thing. Honestly, the Ebony, point of view, to go back to that, is interesting too, and the sort of notion of a different kind of scholarly work with older material, reprinting high quality typography. And so it almost would be interesting to set your work next to Johnson, who I know nothing about, Ebony, these kind of other publishing businesses that are highly invested in the same game for totally different audiences and strategies. So anyway, great stuff, and thank you.
No, thank you. I learned so much from talking to our librarians at Princeton, who have so much institutional knowledge about this in ways that I couldn't even begin to imagine. So I'm really grateful for those comments. There's a really good book that just came out. I'm drawing a blank on the author's name, about Johnson Publishing. So that, I think it just came out maybe last month. So there's that. Remind me the second question. I'm sorry.
I can't remember. We were talking about libraries, and I think the debate about texts and whether
where we can find the editorial vision. Yeah, and what is
existed.
Sorry, I cannot read my own notes, which I think happens from just going from screen to page.
And also what was the most recent thing they chose to publish?
The most recent, they went up to the 1940s. I'm drawing a blank on what the most recent. I know they were. Hurston's Mules and Men is in there in the third series. So they kept getting a little bit more present, They went to the 30s and the 40s. But no, it's really useful to think about the editorial vision that we see popping up in the choice of text. Because Katz he wasn't a total dictator over this. He was quite open. So when Dorothy Porter was like, let's do the convention minutes, he was like, okay. Let's do the Atlanta University studies. Okay, so he was open to the suggestions. So we do actually, there's not a ton of correspondence in the back and forth, but we do see people making suggestions and then taking things off. There was an account of, I think, like Black Civil War soldiers that didn't end up making it. In another iteration of this, I do want to think about why the things that got cut may have gotten cut, or speculate about that a bit. I can't imagine that it's that they fell out of this vision of national harmony, because so many of the texts that are in there are really antagonistic towards the idea of American citizenship and national belonging. So I don't think that was it. Often it was an issue of just what they could get. Like they didn't have access to the text, even if they imagined that they wanted to print it, or somebody else was printing it and they were like, there's an oversaturation of this. That happened a few times. Like Johnson has just put out this, Greenwood Press has just put out this. The text that they did, we do see some editorial vision in the text that they reissued as paperbacks, because those are mostly the literary. So that's where we get a lot of Paul Dunbar. That's where we get like the more of the fictional, the poetry. Those did not sell as well. They ended up with a ton of overflow that they tried to sell to the NAACP. The NAACP was like, this, we can't get rid of these books either. So then there was a moment where they were like getting shipped back and forth and like ended up just like sitting outside Arno's office. Yes, James West is the writer who did that, the book on Ebony that just came out. Thank you, Derek. So right, I do think, and that's something, it's giving me something more to think about, to think more seriously about the titles in there as sites where we can see the editorial vision at play.
I'll just throw in one last thing for my colleague Mitch, who had to leave a little early.
Yeah.
The rhetoric of the advertising they do in Publishers Weekly, alongside the rhetoric of contemporary databases on African American history and literature that are being marketed, to this day to libraries like ours, is there are some connections there.
Even the rhetoric from the New York Times, from the initial one that the initial ad that I posted, the article that I posed, were like, we can learn about this history that is universal but also specific, right? It's exactly the same language that they were using in 1968, and this idea that reading these books will translate to political action. It's an identical project. Yeah.
There's a question that came in through the chat from Federico, which is related to, I think he wanted to know, but he says he's in an area that's very loud, so he sent it through the chat. He wanted to know more about the criteria to determine what text they publish, which you began to address, but particularly about how the project seems to have at least the beginning of strong emphasis on social science.
Yeah. I can go back, although I don't want to go back to the slide. So the criteria was history, the kind of historical moments, scaffolding it in terms of and you're right, there was an emphasis on kind of data-driven information and text here. So it was history, historical moments, literary movements. So giving a broad account of what Black history was, and then series 2 was filling it in. So that was the vision that Katz and Hudson came up with. Again, so much of it had to do with the text they could get their hands on. So there was a way that what emerged in these series is also perhaps not entirely what their vision was. So there was a moment when they decided, like, okay, should we include white authors in here too? Like, should we have Harriet Beecher Stowe, Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin? Should we include white perspectives too? They didn't talk about why that happened, but it may have happened if they weren't able to get the copies, right? Or get the original text to copy. So the criteria, I mean, it was a kind of a come one and come all. I mean, he was like, I want everything, right? So there wasn't a lot of discrimination around what to reprint once it was available, right? The organizational vision, yes, that was kind of a top-down, get the structure, fill it out with individual titles type of thing, like suggesting that only once you know, right, about slavery and freedom, then you can properly read Dunbar's Sport of the Gods, which they published, which was also kind of a curious choice because that's his perhaps least famous work. So again, I mean, they were not interested in commercial appeal, right? I mean, this goes to the point, though, that they chose to publish something like Sport of the Gods, which is still not really canonical. People write about it, sure, but it's not regularly taught in surveys. That they chose to publish that, right, does suggest that they did have a quite clear vision of how they wanted to imagine, right, Black literary practice in relationship to Black history.
Okay, well, I want to thank you for a really terrific talk and a great discussion. And remind everyone that next week, Laura Helton, who just left, just had to run off. Laura Helton will be talking about access restrictions in secret libraries, Virginia Lee, and the policing of Black books. So there'll be probably some continuity from this week to next in thinking about African-American print culture and libraries. But thank you, Autumn, for a terrific talk.
Having me. I'm so grateful for the comments and the conversation, and for you guys for having me. It's been wonderful.